Mr. Fox, are you ready?
Yes.
But yeah, I know what that's his typo.
Did you say you're anxious?
Do you know what it was supposed to say?
No.
You were who?
Yes. Yeah.
What are you doing?
I don't know what happened there. Whether that was my autocorrect or not.
We're not helping our party image today.
My question was, why is Dean Pasadena applicable?
Yeah. Yeah. No, actually, I thought that at first, but I did think that it was.
Please quiet down. Adelson, are you ready?
Yeah, you said it right.
Education for it, not whether I agreed with that.
Quiet down, and you may begin.
Boker Tov, my fellow colleagues of the Las Vegas Mutbei Din.
Boker Tov.
Today we are gathered to examine the 21st century car crash case, which we all reviewed, and make a decision regarding what the verdict should be.
This is quite a unique case. We have Miss Rachel Rubenstein, who was in her Oliva self-driving car when a pedestrian suddenly appeared, causing the car to swerve and hit Mr. Shimon Shalom's manually operated vehicle in the opposite lane. Because of this, Mr. Shalom required extensive medical care and a very long rehab. He decided to sue Miss Rubenstein.
Mr. Eli Levine, president of Oliva Industries, is responsible for programming and manufacturing of the self-driving cars, and Ms. Rubenstein suggested we examine his liability as well.
When I was reading the case, I thought of a few questions we need to ask. Who has to pay Mr. Shalom? Is one person liable for everything? Who is the catalyst of the accident? Is there a problem with the car programming?
Whoa. Slow down. Before we can examine any of these, we have to figure out which type of halakhic damage needs to be applied here. What type of damage do you think is relevant to this case? Well, Bava Comma 1.1 presents the main 4 types of halakhic damage: pit, fire, ox, and chewer. What about the pit? I don't think the pit is relevant because unlike the self-driving car, the pit simply exists. It's immobile.
I agree. Ms. Rubenstein's car is programmed by men and makes decisions that influence its surroundings. It has intentions, to an extent. This can't be said for the pit.
So the pit is irrelevant. What about the chewer?
The chewer is a person or animal who deliberately causes damage. I don't think the self-driving car fits this category. The car has the intention to save lives, not damage.
Now that we have determined that the chewer doesn't apply, let's examine the fire.
I think the fire could apply to our case. Think about it. There's no human action involved in the damages of a naturally occurring fire, just like there was no human action involved in the damages of this accident.
Yeah, Miss Rubenstein didn't make the decision to swerve. The programming did. Okay, so that leaves the question of the ox.
The ox seems the most relevant to me. It acts upon its natural instincts, just like the car acts upon its programming.
I agree. Also, just like an owner of the ox assumed responsibility despite not controlling the ox, Ms. Rubenstein should assume responsibility over the actions of her self-driving car.
So now that we have concluded that the relevant halakhic damages are the ox and the fire, we can determine who is responsible for Mr. Shalom's compensation.
This unprecedented case requires that we examine each person individually to determine their share of the liability.
It's important to note that despite Mr. Shalom being the injured party and the one suing, he can't be held liable because he couldn't have predicted or prevented the accident in any way. I do think it's pretty clear, though, that Ms. Rubenstein is responsible.
How come? She had no control over the car.
Well, that's true. But relying on Bava Comma 2.6, we know that a person is considered warned, meaning liable, whether they're awake or asleep. So even if she wasn't in control and this wasn't intentional on her part, she's still liable.
That's a very good point. I think that she should be found liable for another reason, though. Based off of Shemot 21, 35, and 36, Ms. Rubenstein is responsible for any damages caused by her car because it is her property.
Oh, that was in Bava Comma 8.1.2. The person who hurts his friend is obligated to pay for damages, suffering, medical expenses, time off work, and embarrassment. Wait, Ms. Rubenstein didn't hurt Mr. Shalom directly. It was her car that made the decision to move lanes.
If you keep reading Bava Comma 8.1.2, it states that an ox only pays for the damages. In this situation, the car represents the ox, which is Ms. Rubenstein's property. Since it was the car that caused the accident, Ms. Rubenstein only has to pay for the damages that were inflicted on Mr. Shalom's car.
So we have concluded that Ms. Rubenstein is responsible for the damages to Mr. Shalom's car. What about Mr. Levine? Does he hold any financial responsibility?
I don't think so. The main purpose of his company, Oliva Industries, is to minimize casualties on the road.
I agree. We can rely on Bava Comma 4.4, which says, a stadium ox trained to kill is not liable to be executed. Figuratively, the vehicle is the ox, who's simply doing what it's programmed to do, save lives.
True, I see where you're coming from. This Talmudic source suggests that the programming cannot be held accountable for trying to save lives. If Miss Rubenstein had been in control of her car, the pedestrian would have been killed. She even states in her testimony that she would have just slammed on the brakes, which the programming determined would have killed the pedestrian.
While this is correct, it doesn't explain why Mr. Levine isn't liable, only that the programming is halachically correct.
Tosfot Bava, 60b determines that a person can't be held liable for an attempt to save someone's life. It's unfortunate that Mr. Shalom was injured, but it's not Mr. Levine's responsibility as the CEO to compensate him.
I'm not sure I'm convinced yet.
It's the concept of pikuah nefesh. Here's another strong source to support this. Leviticus 19:16. A person is expected to try and save the life of another if and when they witness them in distress.
Well, following the widely accepted concept of dina de malchuta dina, we can use the Nevada law of strict product liability, which states that a manufacturer will only be held liable in the case of a defective vehicle.
What do you mean by defective vehicle?
Based off the U.S. law regarding defective products, a defective product has to have an imperfection that causes potential danger or harm to the consumer.
Right, and we've just established that the car and the programming were not defective and actually followed proper Jewish laws and values.
I agree. This proves that Mr. Levine cannot be held financially responsible.
That leaves us with the pedestrian.
How can the pedestrian be liable?
Well, the self-driving car was driving according to law, in the proper speed limit, and in a cautious manner. In fact, according to Google's self-driving car project, self-driving cars are permitted only if they are programmed to predict and stop for pedestrians regardless of a crosswalk or light.
This evidence suggests that the pedestrian had to have been crossing at a forbidden time or place, or emerged in a surprising manner, which the self-driving car could not detect.
Bava, 22 says, "He who set the fire must pay," meaning the catalyst of the fire is the liable party. In our case, the catalyst is the pedestrian, because it was his irresponsible actions that caused the accident.
We can also turn to Shemot 22:5, which determines that he who started the fire must make restitution.
If we follow this concept of the catalyst, it is clear that the pedestrian carries more liability than Ms. Rubenstein. He would be responsible to compensate Mr. Shalom for medical expenses, time off work, and pain and suffering.
So now that that's settled, do we think that Mr. Levine needs to change the programming in his car?
I don't think so. We already determined the programming followed proper Jewish law. The main goal is to minimize casualties, and that aligns with Ketubot 19a, which puts human life above almost all else.
Right. If the car had chosen to take a life in order to save Miss Rubenstein, then it might have been in violation of pikuach nefesh.
I do see how pikuach nefesh is a strong argument, but don't you guys think we need more support?
Bava, 311 can be useful. It determines that if a person wants compensation, it is their responsibility to provide the proof. Because Mr. Shalom has no proof that the car or programming were faulty, then he should not change it.
Elizabeth, you spoke earlier about Bava, 44. I think the source could be applied here as well. We know that if an ox gores because it was made to, it can't be held responsible. The same can be said about the car and how it was made to follow its programming.
That's an interesting point you bring up. Another source that can help us is Bava, 60b. In this source, we learned you can't damage another person's property in order to save yourself. Had the car attempted to save itself, this would be in violation of Jewish law.
I think we can all agree that these sources prove that Mr. Levine should not change the programming of his self-driving car.
Yeah.
I think we've covered all of the important questions that this case raises. We determined the two types of halachic damage that apply, the fire and the ox.
Yeah, and based off that, we determined that Miss Rubenstein is responsible for the damage to Mr. Shalom's car and that Mr. Levine owes no financial compensation.
And don't forget the pedestrian. We found him liable for medical expenses, time off work, and pain and suffering.
Finally, we have determined that Mr. Levine and the Leva company aren't required to change any of the car programming.
Rabbis, I appreciate you gathering here today. I am looking forward to our next meeting together.
State judges, you have 8 minutes.
I'm curious about, you talked very much in detail about the manufacturer of the car and the owner of the car. I know that we can't locate the jaywalker, but you didn't really explore the issue of what if we could locate the jaywalker? What would that jaywalker be responsible for? And if, as we know, the jaywalker isn't locatable, does that change your argument? It sounds like you're alluding a little bit to the fact that the other two parties would compensate for the fact that we can't find the jaywalker.
That's not relevant because we're going according to halakhic law, and according to that, the pedestrian is liable.
So the pedestrian is liable for all damages?
We found him liable for medical expenses, time off work, and pain and suffering, and Ms. Rubenstein would be responsible for damages because it was her car that damaged.
Just damages to the car, not
damages to the car.
like him as a person.
So walk me through your analysis, which is If she basically has no control over the car, let me change the example slightly. Let us assume for the moment that I am an evil-doing person, which I probably am. I take you, I tie you up, and I throw you onto someone who gets injured. Is the person who lands on the person who is injured liable? Because that's basically where Ms. Rubenstein is. Or am I liable because I'm the person who caused it?
You would be liable because you're the catalyst of the accident.
So who's the catalyst of the accident here?
The
pedestrian.
pedestrian,
So then why is she responsible for damages?
because it is still her property.
But she was the person who injured. It's her, if it's her property, it's the same thing as if it was her. Her property is an extension of herself. So if you're saying that her property, which is an extension of herself, is liable, why wouldn't, in my example, she be someone who I had tied and bound and thrown on someone be liable?
Well, we compared the self-driving car to an ox, and so if the ox, which is the property, is only responsible for the damages, we think that Ms. Rubenstein, as it's her property, is only responsible for the damages.
But how is that, let me move on to the other part. Why isn't that the same as, why aren't the arguments for Ms. Rubenstein being liable the same arguments that could be made for Mr. Levine being liable? He created the car.
Because he was in line with the proper Jewish laws and the concept of pikuach nefesh, which is putting the sanctity of human life above anything else.
But pikuach nefesh doesn't mean that you can't have civil liability. It just means simply that you are allowed to do various things to save lives. In other words, if I basically try to save a life, but let me give the following example. If I see the ox coming at someone, and in order to save the person's life, I damage someone else's property, doesn't that person have a right to be compensated for the fact that I saved someone's life, but the third party lost some property in the process?
Can you rephrase it?
Sure.
Yeah, I'm not clear.
It's very simple. The fact that he created something to save lives doesn't necessarily mean that he should be absolved from civil liability for tort. It just means that he may well have earned rewards in heaven for having saved a life, but at the same time, he may still be liable for civil damages here.
So we decided to handle this case in a Beit Din, and you're referring to civil law, so I was just kind of wondering what you...
I'm sorry, but I'm using civil law meaning tort law, which is
okay.
halakhic tort law.
Well, in this case, there's no perfect situation for the driving, but what Mr. Levine created didn't violate any Jewish laws and it followed everything properly. And so we believe that because he was following all of those laws, he cannot be held responsible because his company's entire goal is to make driving and being on the roads a safer place.
But, so by driving the car, though, I follow that line of argument. What I don't follow is that Ms. Rubenstein, who didn't have the opportunity to intervene in any way because there's no override, how her responsibility is somehow more or greater than the creator of this potentially damaging vehicle.
We're using that based off of Bava Kama 2 verse 6, which is saying that no matter if she was warned or like in control, she's still liable because it is her property, even if she's not aware of what's happening.
So once the potentially damaging vehicle has been created, then the creator has absolutely no more responsibility for potential damages.
We're saying that because like they followed the proper Jewish laws and values, that in this case that is correct.
And we're also saying that because Ms. Rubenstein went and bought the car and it is now her property, she is now responsible for all that her car does, her property.
Right, you made that, yeah, clear.
Let me a couple of very quick things. Doesn't Bava Kama 2:6 really talk about the fact that there's a human action? So in other words, a person is responsible for his actions, whether he's awake or asleep. What actions did she take here?
Her purchasing of the car makes her responsible for her own property.
Purchasing the car makes her responsible. Okay. Let me ask a couple of other very quick things. Could you explain why there's compensation for lost wages? There's no direct action that's taken that results in injury? In other words, whether it's a pedestrian or anyone else, doesn't it require physical contact based on the Gemara in Bava Kama?
This is a case of first impression, so we're using the concept that the car is acting upon its instincts and trying to save the lives rather than going out and causing, like the ox or like the chewer has the intention to damage, and the car has the intention to save lives.
And one final question that I've got, which is, how does Dina de Malchus Dina come into play here?
So, Dina de Malchuta Dina comes into play here because we believe that we needed to use outside sources and particularly the Nevada law of strict product liability in order to determine that, like, what is a defective vehicle, and we determined that this vehicle is not defective because it followed proper Jewish laws and values.
But, again, I'm still not clear. Is that your basis for finding that Mr. Levine isn't liable?
We use Dina de Malchuta Dina in order to help us look on more modern sources, since this is like the sources that were given are such ancient texts, and so we wanted to be able to use a more modern approach mixed with the ancient texts in order to provide us with a clearer view. And so we use Dina de Malchuta Dina in order to help us look at particular Nevada laws, because we're the Las Vegas Mubaydin, and so in order to give us a clearer image.
I guess, doesn't Dina de Malchus Dina mean that you are supposed to apply, not violate the laws of the state as opposed to apply them?
It could be both, and in this situation, the car did not violate any laws because it was driving in the proper speed limit.
Oh, no, I was talking about the Bezdin using Dina de Malchus Dina. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.